Hi, I'm Tony McMahon and welcome to History's Terrorists. Now, you may have seen me on TV, on documentaries around science and history, but I also have another life, and that is as a communications consultant on counterterrorism and counter-extremism. And it's a field of work that I find absolutely fascinating, as you can imagine. And somewhere behind me here, I have a book that I co-wrote with a woman called Sarah Khan called The Battle for British Islam, very much on this topic area. Now, back in the 1980s, I was a bit of a revolutionary myself. I was a Marxist-Leninist, but I never endorsed terrorism, just to be clear on that. But nevertheless, it gave me an insight into the whole process of radicalization. And that's what this series is about, because we're looking at people and organizations that we may previously have regarded as heroic, even objects, people of veneration, of worship even, and asking the question, were they terrorists? Would we have viewed them as terrorists today? In today's episode, I'm going to be looking at an angle on the suffragettes you may not be familiar with, and that is their involvement in bombing and arson campaigns, essentially in terrorism. Now, you'll have heard about the suffragettes, chaining themselves to railings and smashing shop windows, but they were up to a lot more than that, so that's what we're going to investigate today. Now, I know the story that you have been told at school about the suffragettes, that there was a mother and daughter team, Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst. They split off from the more moderate women's suffrage campaign being run by Millicent Fawcett to found something more radical, the Women's Social and Political Union. And that became known as the Suffragettes. It was originally an insult, but it became something that they appropriated as a name. And then you'll have been told there was this kind of low-level campaign of civil disobedience, the breaking windows and tying themselves to railings and so on, that the government overreacted, that the government were a bunch of misogynist cads who then force-fed women in prison. But along came the First World War. Women played a role in the munitions factories. Everybody realised they should have given women the vote all along, and they got the vote in 1918. Well, what I'm going to show in this episode is there's a bit more to it than that the suffragettes actually embarked between 1912 and 1914 on a concerted terrorist campaign, and that the reaction of the government, while I do not condone force feeding and imprisonment and so on, it has to be seen in that context. There is two sides to this story, essentially. There's a more complex story to be told, and I'm going to tell it today. What I also want to touch on is what happened to some of the suffragettes after the 1918 Representation of the People Act was passed by Parliament, giving women the vote, because some suffragettes took an unusual and frankly disturbing political trajectory. A group of them, quite high-ranking suffragettes, ended up in the British Union of Fascists following Oswald Mosley and sympathising, and in one case even meeting, Adolf Hitler. Now, why on earth did that happen? Well, I think it's linked in part to the ethos of violence that the suffragettes pursued in the run-up to the First World War. Now, before we go any further, I want to tell you about a book written by a historian called Fern Riddell. It's in my bookcase here behind me, and it's called Death in 10 Minutes. And Fern is something of an expert on the suffragettes and the terrorist campaign that they waged. I've had the honour of working with Fern, and I've got to say that what she told me was that the book had a bit of a hostile reception in some quarters because people didn't want to raise this subject. They'd rather that the more anodyne, the more moderate, if you want, version of the suffragette story endures. The terrorist bit of it is airbrushed out of history. Well, we can't do that, can we? So let's go back 120 years. Throughout the 19th century, the vote had been extended over and over again to men. So now most working class men had the vote. And so it seemed iniquitous to a growing number of women, quite rightly, that they didn't have the vote. And especially if you want upper class and middle class women who, to be frank, they could look at their chimney sweep and see that he had the vote and they didn't have the vote. And that just didn't seem right. But there was resistance, and that resistance came from a perhaps surprising quarter. It came from the ruling Liberal Party. Now, this was a time when the Liberal Party was enjoying its height of popularity in Britain. But it was pride before a fall, because the Liberals, after the 1920s, would never take power again and would become the third party in British politics. But at the time of the Suffragette, they were overwhelmingly the main party. They had won a landslide in 1906. That was 3 years after the Pankhursts had set up the Suffragettes. They didn't want to give women the vote. Now, why was that? Well, there's a variety of reasons. Partly they thought that women were more likely to vote Conservative, especially more upper class and middle class women. But also there was just misogyny. I mean, people like Herbert Asquith, the Prime Minister, just didn't believe that women should have the vote. So this led to a polarisation between the Liberal government of Herbert Asquith and the Suffragettes. Now, I should mention as well some of the other people who were in that Liberal government, some titanic political figures, David Lloyd George and a young Winston Churchill before he defected to the Conservative Party. And both of them would be the subject of suffragette attacks as well as Asquith. So let's discuss those bombing campaigns that you may not have heard about. For example, the house, or rather mansion, of David Lloyd George was the subject of an arson attack in February 1913. But also the tea rooms at Kew Gardens were burned down. God knows why the tea rooms caused offence. And also there was an attack on a theatre in Dublin. You have to remember that the whole of Ireland was still part of Great Britain at this time. A theatre in Dublin was subject to a bomb attack, and that was while theatre goers were still leaving the building. So a completely reckless thing to do. Now, Millicent Fawcett, who led the kind of moderate wing of the Votes for Women movement, from whom the Pankhursts had split, she was absolutely horrified by what some of these suffragettes were getting up to, and she condemned it in rather unusual terms. She said that women should be symbols of refinement, and then said that these terrorist acts were the acts we would expect from savages, primitive peoples, and children. Ouch. Well, we wouldn't use that terminology today. But aside from Millicent Fawcett, the media, the newspapers basically, also criticised the Pankhursts. And they retaliated by saying, look, we're not in the business of taking anybody's life. We're just making a point with these bombs, with these arson attacks. But of course, when you go around planting bombs, you can't guarantee that you're not going to take somebody's life or at least injure somebody very badly. Anyway, some of the suffragettes didn't take very kindly to being criticised by the newspapers, and in Belfast, two very well-dressed suffragette women suddenly appeared at the offices of the Belfast Telegraph, a newspaper in the city, and one of them literally punched the editor out of his chair, while the other one threw a bottle of glue at his head. They then, having done that, went down to a rival newspaper, the Newsletter, and pretty much meted out the same treatment to the editor there. He required medical treatment afterwards. By 1912, Christabel Pankhurst decided to relocate to Paris because she was under a certain amount of scrutiny and frankly under threat of being arrested. And she indulged in something that a lot of extremists indulge in, and that is whataboutery. When she was asked about what the suffragettes were doing, she made this curious analogy with a war that was going on in Mexico. And she said, well, these Mexican rebels, they've arrested a government minister and thrown him into prison. I mean, we haven't done that. We've just blown up a minister's house. Now, the impact of these terrorist activities was predictably a hardening of positions on both sides. So the government dug its heels in, the suffragettes upped the ante. Some of the suffragette plots really could have been the subject of a comedy, frankly, an Ealing comedy. One was to kidnap a government minister, take him to a private location, dress him in women's clothes, old women's clothes specified, tie him to a chair, obviously, handcuff him, etc., then put him on trial by an all-female judge and jury, and then the minister would be sentenced to 3 years of penal servitude. Now, there was a bit of shortage of specifics on how this would actually happen and the nature of this servitude, but it just shows how the hostility was increasing daily. One of the things that's definitely been airbrushed out of the history of the suffragettes was their bombing campaign against the Church of England, who they felt hadn't offered significant support in the campaign for votes for women. And so what happened was a campaign that involved destroying church buildings, some utterly destroyed. And in the spring of 1913, a cleaner in St Paul's Cathedral actually heard a ticking sound from behind the bishop's throne, went to investigate and discovered a 6-inch by 6-inch brown paper parcel. Inside it was a bomb. Immediately the police got hold of it. It was put into a pail of water. Now, visitors had only just left the cathedral, so it was by no means assured that there couldn't have been mass casualties. In June 1914, a bomb did actually go off in Westminster Abbey, and it damaged the coronation chair of Edward the Confessor. And people said that it was like the bomb explosion was like a clap of thunder. It could be heard outside in Parliament Square and in Dean's Yard. Other places where bombs were let off was Walgrave Parish Church, which dated back to 1515. That was utterly destroyed. The Church of St John the Evangelist in Westminster, St Martin's in the Fields next to Trafalgar Square. And also, most astonishingly, a bomb was let off in Rosslyn Chapel. Now, you'll remember Rosslyn from the Da Vinci Code, where the end of the film takes place. Well, a small tin of gunpowder and shrapnel, and that was a kind of standard type of bomb used by the suffragettes, was let off in the church, and it damaged several window panes and some of the Gothic tracery, but mercifully no more than that. The other hallmark of these suffragette bombs was that suffragette literature would be placed nearby. Sometimes the bomb itself was wrapped in a suffragette leaflet. What really strikes me in all of this is the kind of disregard that the suffragettes had for working class people. How do you explain bomb packages that were left, for example, in a third-class carriage, or the bomb package that was left under a seat in the waiting room at Lime Street Station in Liverpool, and that was packed with shrapnel? What impact was that supposed to have on ordinary people waiting for their train? But also the planned attacks on dock facilities and on postal depots. What was this going to do other than injure ordinary people? The attack on post boxes became a particular feature of suffragette activity. Police were called to Reading Postal Depot in 1913 because there was a suspect package. Sometimes they had kind of phosphorus bombs in them. But also in one night, 20 post boxes in Edinburgh were completely destroyed. And you have to remember, this is a pre-digital age when people were sending all their correspondence, love letters, official correspondence, bill payments, everything by snail mail through the post box. So this would have impacted thousands of people. There's no doubt that the tactics used, these terrorist tactics that were used, did alienate a lot of people. Now, it undoubtedly piled on pressure onto the authorities, although it gave them also the excuse to introduce draconian legislation. But among the public, opinions became very divided, and there were even attacks on suffragette open-air meetings, for example, in Hyde Park and on Hampstead Heath. And I'm sure there was a huge element of misogyny in this and sexism, but also there were people just disgusted by the bombing campaign. In May 1913, following a police raid on the headquarters of the suffragettes in Kingsway, London, 9 suffragettes were put on trial. And what emerged were plots that involved carrying out bombing and arson attacks on docks, but also on cotton mills and timber yards. And the irresponsibility of that really takes my breath away. You know, the docks obviously full of combustible material, but cotton mills, where most of the workers as well were women, and timber yards, well, needless to say, timber is highly combustible. The plans that were found for these attacks at the suffragette offices were quite detailed. It included the disabling of fire alarms, finding ports of entry, throwing in methylated spirits, benzolene, other flammable liquids, and then causing the maximum amount of damage, the maximum cost. Those in court included Flora Drummond, general organiser of the WSPU, Beatrice Sanders, the financial secretary, and Rachel Barnett, assistant editor of the Suffragette. And they were all charged with conspiracy under the 1861 Malicious Damage to Property Act. Now, the suffragettes may have had a rather blasé attitude to the damage and potential injuries they could have caused to working class males, but they had some very well-heeled female supporters. In this court case, the gallery saw the presence of Princess Sophia Alexandrovna Dulip Singh, who's an extremely interesting person, the daughter of the last Maharaja of the Sikh Empire, whose godmother was Queen Victoria, and she was a prominent suffragette who sold the Suffragette newspaper outside Hampton Court Palace. Another prominent radical aristocrat in court was Muriel Countess de la Warre. Now, she had left the Liberal Party and defected to the Labour Party, and she was also a founder of the East Grinstead Suffrage Union. The court also heard that the suffragettes had been planning attacks on Oxford Street, the main shopping thoroughfare in London, on the main post office, and also the headquarters of the telecommunications network in the UK. And the idea there was to simply throw a bomb in through any open window. Unbelievably, while the trial was going on, there was an attempt to deliver a letter bomb to the judge. Now, this was intercepted by the caretaker, who took it to the assistant usher of the court, who then took it to Scotland Yard. But you have to say, definitely a massive case of chutzpah there on the part of the suffragettes. Now, one of the most audacious attacks was on Holloway Prison, a women's prison in North London, and two dynamite bombs were basically placed against the walls, and the explosion was heard by residents throughout the area. Now, what the suffragettes were probably trying to do was to free a woman called Rachel Peace, whose real name was Florence Jane Short, who was imprisoned at that time in Holloway. Peace had been imprisoned for setting fire to a property called the Elms in Hampton, owned by Rosalind, Countess of Carlisle. While Peace was on trial, 4 other suffragettes were arrested, one of them for trying to throw a hammer at the judge during Peace's trial. Peace was not alone when she was put on trial for the arson attack on the Elms. She was accompanied by another woman called Mary Richardson. Now, Richardson was already well known because she had slashed the Rokeby Venus painting, a 300-year-old painting by the Spanish painter Velázquez. Now, Richardson is of particular interest to me because after women got the vote in 1918, she went off and became a Labour Party activist for a while, but like many people in the 1920s, early 1930s, she became disillusioned with the Labour Party, of the experience of a Labour government, the first Labour government, and she joined the British Union of Fascists in 1932. Now, the BUF was headed up by Britain's answer to Adolf Hitler and Mussolini, a man called Oswald Mosley. You may have seen him dramatised in the series Peaky Blinders. And Mosley fancied himself as a duce or Führer of the future in Britain. Richardson went off and joined him in 1932, and by 1934, she was the women's organiser, national women's organiser for the BUF, so not just any old fascist. And Richardson wasn't the only suffragette to find her way into the British Union of Fascists. In 1934, there was a woman called Nora Ellem, who was General Secretary of the WSPU. She joined, and during the Second World War was interned, ironically, in Holloway Prison, along with other people suspected of having sympathy with Hitler and the Third Reich. Another suffragette who went off and joined the BUF was Mary Sophia Allen. And she had a stint in the mid-1920s, in 1926, with other women trying to break the general strike. In other words, forming a group to act against organised labour. So politically, she was clearly quite reactionary already. She joined the British Union of Fascists, and her dream came true when she got to meet Adolf Hitler himself in Germany, and apparently forever after took to wearing jackboots. Now, this does really intrigue me. Why did some suffragettes end up in the British Union of Fascists? I mean, it just doesn't seem immediately obvious. But let's think about it in the context of what we've learnt about the bombing campaign by the suffragettes. I think this paints some suffragettes in a very different way, that they glorified in the propaganda of the deed, that they showed a disregard, frankly, for their potential victims. And they also were very keen on a leadership cult, because one of the criticisms by other women and even by some suffragettes was that the Pankhursts were dictatorial in their management style of the women's social and political union. So for some suffragettes, maybe they were in search of a new leader to follow. They'd followed the Pankhursts, now they just switched their loyalty to Oswald Mosley. Look, in all of this, I'm never going to detract from the fact that the cause of the suffragettes and the moderate so-called suffragists was entirely valid. You know, the campaign for votes for women was completely right, and it was absolutely iniquitous that women did not have the vote at that time. But this series is called History Terrorists, and we're looking at organizations and people who did employ terrorist methods. And it is incontrovertible that the suffragettes decided to use terrorism. And I do believe that this has been airbrushed out to an extent. We're just presented with women breaking shop windows and chaining themselves to railings. That simply is not a true picture. There was a bombing campaign, there were arson attacks, and, you know, they're very lucky that there wasn't a higher rate of fatalities and injuries. And also intriguing is the response of the state, because I wonder today, even looking back over the last 50 years, what treatment the suffragettes might have had from the state these days. Back then, it was force feeding in prison because they were going on hunger strike. But now, well, they've been sent to some equivalent of Guantanamo. Who knows? You tell me what you think. Now, this is an episode that could go on, and I know it's quite contentious, but I'm going to leave it to you to come back and tell me what you think about it. But for today, from my glorious study here in South London, I'm going to wave you goodbye, and we'll be back very soon to discuss a conspiracy that intended to take the life of the British Prime Minister and the entire cabinet while they were sat down to dinner. So join me for that. Goodbye for now.